After a car accident, who was chosen as the spokesperson for the deity to destroy the fantasized worlds on his behalf. Who didn't want to die, could only agree to the other person's request. The deity brought who's soul to Marvel Universe, and who regained his life, said it was impossible to destroy the world. Even if he begged for food, he would not destroy the world. One day, who was imprisoned on the street and was about to have his organs dug out. Helpless, who had to go into business and prepare to start his own world journey, gradually becoming a world destroyer without emotions. Keywords of the novel. Marvel World Destroyer. No pop-ups. Full download of Marvel World Destroyer TXT, latest chapter reading of Marvel World Destroyer. Chapter 1. Accident Scene. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Where am I worse than her? Please don't leave me. A woman in her 20s hugged the thigh of a sleazy man and kept crying. Her dark blue jeans were also worn out while dragging, revealing the snow-white skin inside. Who was about to cross the road, suddenly came to his senses. No matter how the math on the indicator light danced, it couldn't stop his eating heart. Seeing someone watching the woman cry even louder, woo-woo-woo-woo, even for the sake of the child. Please, don't leave us. The old men and women who had originally planned to cross the street heard that there were still children, and they all came to their senses. They started pointing at the man, looking at him with a scumbag-like expression. Release it. Release it for me. The man roared angrily and kept shaking his thighs. Several strong men couldn't bear to watch and slowly walked out of the crowd to surround the man in the middle. If I say this is a misunderstanding, do you believe it? Looking at the four big men with big arms and round waists, the sleazy man immediately hesitated. What kind of thing? The scumbag I can't stand the most is you. The four big men went up and punched and kicked, and the woman took advantage of the situation to pick up her shoulder bag from the ground. She opened it and looked inside, only to find that there was nothing missing. She stood up and tidied up her clothes. As she passed by the battlefield, her big furry leg exposed to the lewd man was just a kick. During the fight, a dagger fell from the lewd man, and the four strong men immediately retreated upon seeing the situation. Come here. If you have the guts, come back. How come there are so many robberies? Come up. Aren't you very capable of fighting? The sleazy man shook his dagger and shouted hysterically. The four strong men slowly retreated, and whose expression stunned him as he glanced at the woman across the street, exclaiming in his heart that he was an expert. Stinky kid, you really enjoy watching the excitement. Upon hearing the man's shout, Mark looked around and found that within a few seconds of turning around, the elderly, and the four strong men had already run away without a trace. Don't run away. Look at me if I don't stab you, you bastard. Watching the lewd man charging with a knife, who swallowed his saliva and turned around to run. He didn't expect the flames of war to spread to him. Looking at the green light with only 3 seconds left, who decided to take a gamble. The sleazy man stopped to look at the indicator lights and then at the surrounding car conditions, with a hint of hesitation in his eyes. However, thinking of whose previously infuriating onlooker appearance, an unnamed flame rose in his heart in a fit of anger. Who threw the dagger out to teach the other person a lesson. As he ran, his body trembled and he fell onto the zebra crossing, with the dagger accurately inserted into his heart. The sleazy man was completely bewildered. He had just aimed at his leg, and how could it have deviated so much? Moreover, his own strength could not have allowed the dagger to pierce the opponent's heart completely. No, it's not me. The sleazy man shouted to escape from the battlefield, and who felt the temperature on his body quickly disappear. The sound of horns around him was very piercing. Damn it, don't get in the way. A driver was frantically honking his horn, and the lane next to him had already begun to move forward. However, his side was blocked, and the horn behind him had no intention of stopping. After glancing at the rearview mirror, the driver suddenly turned the steering wheel and left. The driver behind him stared at the person lying on the ground, but the sound of the horn from behind did not stop. The driver immediately felt the mood of the person in front of him and after some thought, chose to follow the footsteps of his predecessor. If destroying a world can keep you alive, would you destroy it? A voice rang in Ihu's ear, and he felt his vision instantly widen. He lowered his head to look down at the sidewalk where he had an accident, and the ethereal sound rang out again, "You haven't answered my question yet." At this moment, Ihu seemed to grab the last straw and his expression became fierce, roaring loudly, "I will. I will destroy it. Please help me." A man's figure appeared in front of Ihu, who stood with his hand down and looked like an extraordinary expert, but his words were very cold. "The universe gives birth to a batch of worlds every day. I need you to choose a world as a transit station, go to those imagined worlds to kill the core characters, and finally destroy the transit station you have chosen." Ihu's eyes flickered slightly, and worlds came to mind. Before he could answer, he heard the man's cold voice, "Now I give you two choices. First, I will send your soul to the world of novels, and second, I will send your soul to the world of movies and TV shows. Can you send my soul back to my body and call me an ambulance? I think I can still save it." Ihu swallowed his saliva and looked pitifully at the back of the figure, feeling extremely uneasy. He felt that the other party might perhaps meet his small request. "Good boy, I didn't expect you to be so brave. You chose the most challenging Marvel universe as a transit station." "Ah. I'm not. I don't have it. Don't talk nonsense. When did I say I wanted to choose Marvel? The last boy who chose DC was also as brave as you. Although he has died, his spirit has been continued in you. Come on. I'll keep an eye on you." After taking a step and taking Ihu into the universe, the two of them took another step and arrived at the sky above a city. Looking at the surging crowd below, Ihu swallowed his saliva and whispered, "Is this Marvel? Is it real? The planet you are on possesses special powers, and whenever the creatures on it construct a scene in their minds, it will manifest in a certain universe and gradually evolve into a complete world." The man waved his hand and a system panel appeared in front of Ihu, which contained his basic information, as well as 4 options. Backpack, world, contract, and mall. There is a list here, and all you need to do is find the plot characters based on the information above and deal with them. After the task is completed, the system panel will devour the world. When you accumulate enough strength to destroy the Marvel world, I will fulfill your wish. There is a private sponsorship I gave you in your backpack. Come on, young man. The next second, Ihu's consciousness began to blur and a sense of heaviness came from his body. When he woke up again, he was already on a 10-meter-wide bed, looking at the luxurious decorations in the bedroom with his right hand quietly resting on his thigh. A sound of inhalation echoed in the room, and Ihu excitedly felt and looked around in the bedroom. He didn't expect that mysterious man to be so bold and directly make himself a millionaire. Ha ha ha. This teapot is not bad. Dad will definitely like it. This vase is really beautiful. You can take it back to Mom to plant flowers. The smile on Ihu's face gradually disappeared, and he realized that he was no longer in the same world as them. To be precise, he had already died on the road, and by now his body was probably turned into ashes. Chapter 2, Is This Too Hasty? You are listening at novelfull.audio. Dad. Mom. Ihu sat by the bedside, staring blankly ahead, and casually picked up the blanket beside him to wipe away his tears and nose. Don't worry, your parents are doing well. A ethereal voice echoed in Ihu's heart, followed by a screen where his parents watched him cremate with tears in their eyes. Dad and Mom. Ihu rushed down the mountain with a fierce tiger, then fell a dog and nibbled on the mud. The screen in front of him disappeared, and when he looked up, the screen appeared again in front of him. Ihu slowly retreated to the bedside, picked up the blanket and kept wiping away tears. Watching my mother cry and fall into a coma in the picture, I deeply regret my onlooking behavior. Watching the shock and joy flickering on their faces as they received the medical examination report, Ihu was slightly taken aback and couldn't understand what was going on. When Ihu saw two people winning first prize in the lottery with the change they had paid for medical expenses, he exclaimed in his heart that he was lying down. He had made so many years of contributions to public welfare that he didn't even see a trace of it as a result. His parents seemed to be cheating, and he really wanted to ask the other party if his own life had affected their performance. 9 months later, the two gave birth to a baby boy and lived a happy and wealthy life. As the screen went out, there was also Ihu's lying heart. He couldn't describe his feelings in words anymore. The feeling of separation and death that he had felt before disappeared instantly. He glanced at the luxurious bedroom and Ihu whispered in a low voice, "Perhaps this is also good. Everyone can live a happy and fulfilling life as a wealthy person." After Ihu wiped away his tears with a blanket and learned that his parents were doing well, his mood gradually calmed down. It is impossible to destroy the world, it is impossible in this lifetime. Since his parents are healthy and he has become a millionaire again, Ihu has decided to spend the rest of his life playing the flute overnight. He wants to beat 10 young girls in a clubhouse. At this moment, the alarm at the bedside suddenly rang, disrupting his imagination. As soon as the alarm was turned off, there was a knocking sound at the door. Ihu frowned and opened the door with some displeasure. "Mr. E, how do you feel? Remember to send us your feelings in writing afterwards." "What? Isn't this my house? What other report should I write?" Ihu was a bit confused. The waiter had a professional smile on his face and said softly, "Mr. E, you are so humorous. All right, I won't say that anymore. I still need to inspect the house. Please cooperate." Thinking of the runny nose on the blanket, Ihu instinctively wanted to stop the other person, but after seeing the 4 black bodyguards on both sides, Ihu wisely chose to make way. "Mr. E, could you explain to me what this situation is?" Ihu looked in the direction of the waiter's finger and blushed with embarrassment, saying, "It's too cold, there's a slight cold." The waiter looked up at the 25 degrees Celsius air conditioner and the corners of his mouth twitched slightly. After checking, he found that nothing was left behind, and the waiter did not scold Ihu. Anyway, they also wanted to change this set of blankets. Ihu put on his clothes and took the elevator to the first floor. He walked out of the door and looked up at the restaurant on the 30 floors behind him, with a slight sigh in his heart. Taking out his wallet and opening it, he found only $300 inside. After checking the address recorded on his ID, Ihu stopped a taxi. An hour later, the taxi stopped in front of a residential building 3 blocks away from the hotel. Looking at the remaining $50 in his hand, Ihu pointed his middle finger towards the taxi that was heading away. The other party slammed the brakes and began to reverse, causing Ihu to rush towards the house, hurriedly opening the door, picking up the baseball bat from the table and waving it twice, waiting for the other person to come and get beaten. "You damn yellow-skinned monkey, get out of here." Ihu's face turned cold. What he disliked the most was racial discrimination. He clenched the baseball bat in his hand, opened the door, and prepared to give the opponent a bloody lesson. Next second a black muzzle pointed at his chest, and Ihu raised his baseball bat with both hands and knelt on the ground with a thud, paying for his impulse. The strong man searched for all the things on Ihu's body, including the worn-out watch, but he did not enter the room. The strong man just wanted to scare Ihu and had no intention of killing anyone. After all, there were still a few surveillance cameras around, and he didn't expect Ihu to miss out on something so innocent. The strong man threw several documents on the ground, casually placed his wallet in his arms, and turned towards his beloved car. After a burst of engine noise, the taxi drove into the main road. Ihu stood up and looked around, but found no one there. He quickly rushed into the house and cursed softly, "Damn it. Just leave me a pair of underwear so I don't see you again." Looking at the old decorations inside the house, Ihu sighed. Although life was very bleak, he still didn't want to carry out any mission to destroy the world. He had promised the other party purely because he was afraid of death. Now, although he lives well and doesn't have much money, can a living person still starve to death in this city? Who walked into the bathroom, took a shower, changed clothes, and returned to the somewhat messy bedroom. He opened his laptop and prepared to write down his sleep test speech. The person who logged into Facebook and found the hotel avatar, clicked on the message sent by the other person, and was completely stunned. Previously, he was able to communicate fluently with others and thought it was a benefit of his travels, but he only knew how to read and not write, which is quite outrageous. Who, you can do it. Come on. After some encouragement, Who began to search for videos with subtitles, listening to the meaning expressed in the other person's language, and then began to study seriously by comparing the subtitles below. An hour later, Who rubbed his eyes. The person in the video was too dedicated. Even though he was a big man, he still couldn't forget to express his inner emotions. It wasn't until 3 a.m. that Who began to feel tired. Ignoring the toilet paper on the ground, she walked straight to the bed and slowly closed her eyes. The female teacher on the computer was pointing to the blackboard to teach students theoretical knowledge, while the students under the podium listened very attentively. Finally, under the guidance of the female teacher, Who slowly fell into his dream while listening to her ambiguous voice. Da-da-da-da. A dense sound of bullets woke him up from his sleep. Who casually turned off his computer and cautiously walked to the window, watching the two groups of people on the street burning together, subconsciously swallowing saliva. Only orange fireworks and the sound of bullets hitting the body could be seen on the pitch-black street. Suddenly, the glass on the right side was shattered by stray bullets, and Who lay on the ground, trembling with both hands holding his head. 5 minutes later, the fighting outside stopped. Who took a deep breath of his heart beating violently under the pressure, looked at the broken window, and decided to go to the agent tomorrow to sell the house to China. Whoever loves to treat him in this rundown place doesn't want to stay for a moment. Chapter 3. Streets. You are listening at novelfull.audio. What? Is this house rented? Yes, sir. If you need to change your living environment, we have houses on all sections of the Hell Kitchen here. Wait a minute, Who interrupted the man's narration with a raised hand, feeling somewhat incredulous. Where did you say this was just now? Hell's Kitchen. What's wrong, sir? The man was somewhat surprised and didn't understand why the other party was asking this question. Who slowly stood up and ignored the man's plea, leaving the agency company directly. Upon hearing this name, he suddenly remembered that he was in Marvel, not in some parallel world. When he returned home, Who used his thoughts to communicate with the panels in his mind. There are 4 options on it. Backpack, Mall, Contract, and World. Among them, only Backpack and World are lit, and the rest of the options have a small lock logo. Opening the backpack, Who immediately saw a card and focused his mind on it, quickly revealing the function of the card: Divine Blessing. When using it, shout out that I am Fate, and you will receive half an hour's use of Counter Heaven Luck. One looking at the card, Who had a bold idea in his heart and began to think about the feasibility of using it to buy lottery tickets. Finally, let go of the thoughts in your heart. This thing is just a way out and cannot be squandered casually. Just then, there was a knocking sound at the door. Who opened the door and saw an elderly woman in her 60s looking at him with an angry expression on her face. Who are you looking for? When will you pay me your rent? You're already 2 days overdue. I'm asking you to give me an extra 50 as compensation. Who turned his head to avoid the saliva from the other person, and an awkward smile appeared on his face. The son behind the landlord seemed to be difficult to get along with, and after Who's righteous argument misses, Felicia gladly accepted Who's notebook and generously stated that he didn't need to pay for the glass. Who, wearing short-sleeved shorts, was respectfully sent out of the house by Mrs. Felicia and her plump son. It wasn't until he walked out of the street that the smile on Ehu's face gradually disappeared, and in just one day, he fell into such a state of poverty. I have nothing on me except a few documents. Looking at the blonde hair and blue eyes coming and going on the street, a sense of loneliness surged in my heart. After walking aimlessly for half an hour, I instinctively came to the hotel where I woke up yesterday, looked up at the gradually darkening sky, sighed, and then went to the nearby park. Looking at the homeless man on the lounge chair, there was a hint of confusion in his eyes. He didn't know how to live his life in the future, whether to continue living in such a daze or embark on the path of destroying the world. Just as Ehu was pondering, several black-clothed people walked up to him and whispered, "Our organization is recruiting snatchers for 50,000 a month. As long as you dare to shoot." The other party's words were like the whispers of demons. Ehu swallowed his saliva and shook his head vigorously. Several men looked at each other and then placed their targets on the next homeless person. 10 minutes later, 5 black-clad men and 20 homeless people left the park and entered 3 vans. As Ehu watched the rapidly departing convoy, a hint of regret flashed in his heart, but this feeling came and went quickly. The next day, Ehu bravely endured his hunger and walked on the road seeking help. A 15-year-old boy sat not far from Ehu, holding a piece of cardboard with some help-seeking messages written on it. Ehu curled up and looked at the little boy with sympathetic eyes. He sat here for an hour but didn't see anyone give him a coin. The child was probably even more helpless. "Poor child, may God bless you." A woman wearing mink skin on her shoulder bent down and touched the little boy's head. She took out 5 Franklin sheets from her wallet and placed them in the other person's hand. She stood up and looked at Ehu with disdainful eyes. "Am I special? Have beggars been beaten up like this? Do you still have any royal rules?" Ehu looked at the little boy speechlessly as he earned 1,000 yuan in just half an hour. Every person who offered love would look at him with disdainful eyes, and some would even spit at him. At night, Ehu returned to the park and lay weakly on a chair, staring intently at the world options on the system panel. As he had said before, as long as he could survive, he didn't mind destroying the world, let alone dealing with some plot characters. Just as Ehu was selecting the world, a sound of footsteps came from a distance. Looking at the group of black-clad people Ehu last night, he was a bit indecisive. Crossing the world was too risky, but being a jigsaw puzzle was also a road to no return. I'm willing to shoot." Ehu struggled to stand up and the leading black man sneered, waved his hand, and 2 strong men left the team to pick him up and walk towards the van. The driver handed him a panel and half a bottle of mineral water, which seemed to be each other's dinner. Ehu said thank you, picked up the bread and stuffed it into his mouth. He touched his belly and showed a smile on his face. 10 minutes later, 5 black-clothed people and 3 homeless people walked up to charter a car. The van turned around 7 times and entered a factory. 5 black-clad men escorted 4 of them into the factory, smelling the pungent smell of disinfectant in the air. Ehu's pupils suddenly shrank, and the words, "selling organs," flashed through his mind. Just as he was about to resist, he saw the leading black man take out a gun and look at him with cold eyes. "Don't worry, organs are not sold here," the strong black man said calmly. "You only need to cooperate and complete an experiment before you can leave." Ehu's previously relieved heart lifted again. Human experiments were much scarier than selling organs. Although he wanted to curse in his heart, under the threat of gunfire, Ehu still chose to take steps. Looking at a guy with bone spurs in a compartment, Ehu's heart pounded violently and the words, "mutant," flashed through his mind. The idea of crossing the world immediately faded away, and instead of destroying the world, it was better to exchange the divine protection for a superpower here. With the thought in mind, Ehu's emotions gradually calmed down, and a hint of praise flashed in the eyes of the strong black man beside him. He decided to talk to his head later and focus on taking care of this determined guy. After completing the handover, the strong black man came to the side of a young man in a white robe and whispered a few words. The young man in a white robe carefully looked at Ihu and then nodded, placing the four of them in different compartments. Maku told me you have great potential. My name is Ajax and I am the person in charge here. The young man said as he observed Ihu's body. He reached out to take the syringe handed by a woman beside him and injected a light blue liquid into Ihu's body. Looking at Ihu's twisted expression, Ajax's eyes flashed with a hint of disappointment. Ah! Ihu let out a heart-wrenching roar and watched as the woman next to Ajax, whose eyebrows were slightly furrowed, quickly blocked Ihu's mouth with a cloth strip. 1 minute later, Ihu's body began to expand, and his belt, which was originally bound to him, was being stretched and clattered. The woman's forehead was sweating and her hands were tightly pressing down on Ihu, no longer looking as relaxed as before. A hint of surprise flashed in Ajax's eyes. Chapter 4. Successful Mutation. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Ajax and Angel pushed Ihu into the laboratory, which is a rare experimental subject. They decided to study it carefully. Watching Angel walk towards him with a surgical knife, Ihu instinctively wanted to struggle, and his body began to grow with his thoughts. Ajax injected a potion into Ihu's body. A few seconds later, Angel fixed the unconscious Ihu on the wall and walked out of the laboratory, manipulating the robotic arm to inject different drugs into Ihu's body. Looking at Ihu, whose blood vessels were bulging and could explode at any moment, the two shook their heads slightly with a hint of disappointment in their eyes. The intense pain woke Ihu up and he felt the power of the rampage in his body. Ihu shifted his gaze to the divine protection in his backpack, silently reciting it in his heart before whispering in a low voice, "I am fate." As soon as the words fell, the pain on his body disappeared instantly. Looking at Ihu, who had returned to normal, Ajax operated his robotic arm again to inject medication into his body until all the medication had been injected before stopping. Looking at the densely packed abilities on the system panel, Ihu frowned slightly. Most of the abilities were just flashy garbage. What can become incredibly handsome in a place without anyone? Why should he be handsome when there is no one left? As he pondered how to refine his abilities, the panel changed. A large number of abilities merged with each other, leaving only 6 abilities. Super Hearing, Super Vision, Self-Healing Ability, Thermal Radiation, Steel Body, and Spiritual Power. Feeling the surging power in his body, Ihu's mouth slightly raised and his eyes stared sharply at the glass wall. The excited two of them trembled as they looked at Ihu's cold eyes. He won't rush out, will he? Don't worry, Angel. This laboratory is not so easy to break through, Ajax comforted his assistant. Before the two of them could breathe a sigh of relief, they saw the iron plates that bound Ihu begin to twist and deform. Ajax turned around and ran away. Angel was stunned for a few seconds before he realized it. He quickly chased after the figure in the distance, and Ihu stood barefoot on the ground, using his mental strength to knead the 1-meter-thick iron gate in front of him into a large iron ball. Angel, who was running for his life in the distance, showed a cruel smile. 2 thermal rays shot out of his eyes, and Angel, who was running, felt his body light and fell to the ground, causing a sharp pain in his abdomen. Looking at the sudden appearance of a pair of bare feet in front of him, Angel lifted his head and looked at Ihu with pleading eyes, saying intermittently, "Please. Please. Let me go." Ihu's eyes flickered with a red light, and he turned his head to look at Ajax. Just then, a laboratory in the distance suddenly exploded, and a figure swayed out of the flames. The burnt black flesh began to heal quickly, and looking at the unrecognizable face, Ihu furrowed his brows and approached Ajax. Spiritual Power. Super Power. Thermal Radiation. Ha ha ha, you're such a perfect weapon. Ajax's face blushed, although he couldn't escape from life, he felt proud to have made such a weapon. Ihu reached out and grabbed Ajax's neck. In his eyes, the speed of the opponent's avoidance was a slow motion. Ajax reached out and grabbed Ehu's hand tightly, struggling hard. With both legs vigorously kicking and kicking Ehu's body, a dull impact sound came from the air. Ajax looked at the opponent's shiny silver body with a shocked expression. Just as Ehu was about to kill Ajax, a sound sounded from behind, "Can you hand him over to me, buddy?" Ehu calmly stared at the ugly man behind him and remained silent for a second. After throwing Ajax in front of him, he turned around and walked towards the door. Several black-clad men on duty trembled and took out their pistols to aim at Ehu. 1 minute later, Ehu was wearing a black suit, eating pizza on the table while listening to Ajax's mournful cries, "Wade. Only I can cure your injury." Wade stopped his movements upon hearing this, and just as Ajax's face showed signs of joy, a dagger pierced through his back and was fiercely nailed to the ground. "I may be able to heal your injury." Ehu walked up to Wade and reached out his hand to press on him. The luck brought by divine protection allowed him to infinitely magnify a possibility in something. So he was able to merge dozens of abilities into 6. Ehu imagined in his mind that Wade's healing ability could surpass cancer cells. 3 minutes later, a handsome man shouted excitedly in the ruins. "Hey buddy, my name is Wade and you'll be my good friend from now on." Listening to the other person's endless words, Ehu, who had super hearing, felt like there were 1,000 ducks chirping in his ear. He used to quite like the other person in movies, but now he just wants to sew up that stinky mouth. Wade, who was speaking, covered his mouth in fear, and an invisible force blocked his mouth. After struggling to no avail, Wade turned his gaze to Ehu. "Remember to keep your mouth shut in front of me in the future." "Okay." Wade nodded hard, and the blockage in his mouth suddenly disappeared in the next second. Looking at the divine protection with 1 minute left, Ehu whispered, "I want some money." Upon hearing this, Wade quickly walked over to Ehu and placed his hand on the other person's shoulder, speaking grandly, "Hey, brother, are you crazy? I know a very good doctor." Before they could finish speaking, the floor under their feet suddenly cracked open. Ehu used his mental power to park himself in the air, watching the corner of his mouth slightly rise from the safe below. Wade, who had fallen and was eating shit, looked up at the safe with a beastly expression on his face. Ehu used his psychic power to tear open the safe and wrap it inside the suitcase. The next second, the suitcase appeared in his backpack. Previously, it was necessary for him to touch things with his body when storing them, but now with spiritual power, he only needs to wrap the items and directly put them into his backpack. Ehu patted Wade's shoulder and used his mental strength to support him as he flew up the pit, smashing the ceiling and taking a look at the police car attracted by the explosion in the air. He randomly chose a direction to leave the factory. "Goodbye, little slut." Ehu threw Wade into the alley and several flashes disappeared from each other's sight. The eyes of the elderly Professor X at Xavier Genius Academy flickered slightly. Just now, he felt a powerful energy wave. He wanted to communicate with the other person, but was unilaterally blocked. "Charles." Ehu landed in a small alley with his eyes flickering, some understanding why Magneto had to wear a helmet. He had just been able to block Charles completely because of the distance, and if he had to face each other face-to-face, he didn't have the confidence to surpass them. The originally inflated heart immediately cooled down. The next morning, Vanessa pushed open the door and looked at the naked man in front of her in surprise, shouting, "Wade. Hi. Darling. Can I come in and change clothes?" Vanessa excitedly threw herself into the arms of the death attendant, and the two of them left many marks all the way from the door to the living room, then to the bathroom, and finally back to the bedroom. Chapter 5. Goodbye. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Ehu looked at the eye panel and saw that except for the suffix in the character column, which changed from ordinary people to surface level, everything else remained unchanged. Ehu, who was carrying 800,000 yuan, was preparing to buy a house. Before arriving at the agency building, the agency that had received him slowly approached and respectfully said, "Sir, are you still changing houses this time? I plan to buy a house with a budget of 700,000 yuan. The man's eyes lit up and his smile became sincere. He took out a map and began recommending houses. Although various events often occurred here in his memory, with his strength, these were not problems. This was much more enjoyable than spending money to see in the cinema. Is there a residence near Starkdashia? Hu looked excitedly at Starkdashia on the map, thinking that living nearby would be more convenient for him to watch the play up close. The man hesitated and glanced at Hu. Although he wanted to tell the other party that he wanted to buy a house near Stark Summer for 700,000 yuan and was thinking nonsense, when he thought about the commission for this business, he still tried to swallow his dirty words and squeezed out a smile, whispering softly, "How do you like the 6th Avenue in the city?" The man pointed to a place 6 streets away from Starkdashia and looked nervously at Hu. "Okay, help me complete the procedures today and I'll give you an extra 10,000 yuan in compensation. Don't worry. I will definitely do it for you." The man's eyes turned red when he heard of the extra reward. 10 minutes later, Hu walked into the police station and used his mental power to control a police officer to help him apply for a social security card. It was troublesome not to have an ID card here. 4 hours later, both parties signed their names in the presence of lawyers. Hu obtained this 300 square meter detached villa. Although the seller was surprised by Hu's use of cash payment, they didn't pay much attention, as long as the franklin they received was real. After seeing off a few people, Hu sat on the sofa, looking at the world options on the system panel. After hesitating for a few seconds, he slowly clicked on them, searched for them, and then stopped his gaze on the pattern of the Supermarine Corps. After feeling dizzy, Hu appeared on a street. I dodged the delivery guy's flying car sideways, feeling a bit uncomfortable with the strong anime atmosphere around me. As night fell, Hu flew into the sky and saw the whole world, a continent with 3 small islands. When he arrived at the edge of the continent and found everything here to be illusory, he wanted to reach out and touch it but was blocked by an invisible wall. After calming down one's inner emotions, it is easy for the tiger to fly towards the city where the plot takes place. As soon as he entered the town, he saw a big fire in the distance and understood that it was the beginning of the plot. Teddy's death made Xiaohong very uncomfortable. He locked himself in the room for several weeks, turned on his computer, and looked at the concerned greetings from several friends on the video. Xiaohong smiled bitterly at the corners of his mouth and casually replaced the computer. At first, he wanted to prove to his brother that he wanted to be the pride of the other party, but now everything is not important. Xiaohong threw the admission letter on the table into the trash can, picked up his combat robot, and prepared to participate in the robot competition. It hurts so much. Xiaohong sat on the bed with his feet covered and let out a painful cry. The box in the corner of the room flickered twice before it began to expand. The cute and soft-looking Debai cautiously approached Xiaohong and whispered in front of him, "Hello, I am Debai, your personal health consultant." Looking at the familiar robot in front of Xiaohong, a hint of nostalgia flashed in his eyes, but he was soon angered by Debai's annoying inquiry. After a fight, Xiaohong discovered the micro-robot inside the bed jacket and whispered, "This thing should have been attracted by other micro-robots, but they should have all been destroyed in the fire." Xiaohong casually put the micro-robot into a glass cover and began debugging the battle robot to prepare for the robot competition a few days later. Debai carefully held the glass cover and watched Xiaohong speak softly, "Where does your little robot want to go?" "I don't know." "Why don't you go find out where it wants to go?" Xiaohong casually said while debugging the battle robot. After debugging the parts, Xiaohong suddenly realized that something was missing around him. Looking at the fat figure on the road outside the window, he quickly picked up his coat and ran downstairs. Debai is a memory left for him by his older brother. He does not allow himself to lose the other person. Xiaohong came to the first floor and found an excuse to perfunctory. The enthusiastic ant opened the door and chased after Dabai. As he passed by the street, a news came from the TV, "Attention everyone, there have been several natural disasters recently that have engulfed nearby small islands. Please do not approach the coastline unless necessary." Although Dabai's steps were small, their frequency was fast, and Xiao Hong could only keep the other person in his own sight. Hu slowly landed on the beach. In recent weeks, he went to a nearby island to test his strength. With full force, he was able to sink a small island with a diameter of 5 kilometers within a week. Hu also understood that the strength represented by the surface level was not as inflated as before, and he was still far behind those giants who could easily destroy planets. After a chase, Xiaohong and Dabai entered an abandoned factory and looked at the micro-robots being processed inside. Xiaohong's eyes flashed with shock, and the next second, all the micro-robots converged into a black giant wave rushing towards each person and machine. 5 minutes later, Dabai used his plump body to protect Xiaohong from jumping out of the window on the 3rd floor. Hu stood in front of Xiaohong and said in a deep voice, "I can help you find the arsonist and get you revenge, the price is it." Xiaohong looked at the man who suddenly appeared with a dull expression on his face. After a moment of silence, he whispered, "You. Are you saying that someone deliberately set the fire on?" Thinking that his brother's death was not an accident, Xiaohong's eyes immediately turned red and he gritted his teeth and said, "Tell me. Who set the fire?" Watching Hu's indifferent gaze, Xiaohong gradually regained his senses and fell silent for a second before whispering, "I agree." Transaction reached. Hu snapped his fingers and used his mental power to grab the professor who was eavesdropping on the 3rd floor, casually crushing the mask on the other person's face. "Professor." Looking at the figure under the mask, Xiaohong's eyes flashed with confusion and hatred. Smart Xiaohong combined with the micro-robot discovered on the scene to immediately simulate the other person's criminal motive. The hatred instantly engulfed his rationality, and Xiaohong rushed towards the professor like a madman, beating him with his hands and feet until he was exhausted before sitting on the ground and shouting with his hoarse figure, "My brother died because he went to save you. Why did he do this?" Upon hearing Xiaohong's words, a hint of guilt flashed in the doctor's eyes. Hu crushed the doctor's limbs and threw him on the ground like throwing garbage. He looked at Xiaohong and whispered, "Now it's your turn to make a choice." Looking at the struggling professor, a hint of unbearable emotion flashed in Xiaohong's eyes. 3 minutes later, Xiaohong walked home with Hu and Dabai. "I am very satisfied with your service." Xiaohong looked at Dabai and whispered softly. As soon as he finished speaking, Dabai packed himself into a red box. Xiaohong's eyes flickered with surprise as he watched the box disappear in an instant. This was the first time he had seen space folding technology. "Sorry." Hu looked into Xiaohong's eyes as a thermal ray flashed, and the surrounding scenery gradually became meaningless after Xiaohong's death. 1 minute later, Hu stood in the chaos, looking at the super-powerful Marine Corps illuminated on the panel, with the idea of lighting up all the icons flashing in his heart. Chapter 6. Jessica. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Hu locked the door and walked towards the shopping mall 2 blocks away, preparing to buy some furniture for his new home. As he passed by a hotel, he suddenly heard a somewhat sickly voice, "Jessica. I want you to fall in love with me from the bottom of your heart." Looking sideways, she saw a fashionable brown-haired beauty tightly embracing a man in a purple suit. Although the woman appeared very angry, the tightly hugging action of the man showed an extraordinary relationship between the two. Hu thought that the couple was playing cosplay and turned around to leave. "Jessica, let's play a little game. I bet you can kill him with just 1 punch. If I lose, how about letting you go?" Kevin Thompson's words were like the whispers of a demon. Jessica's face showed a painful expression, but her body remained calm as she walked up to Hu and swung her right hand fiercely towards the opponent's head. After a loud bang, Jessica's fair and tender right hand stopped in the air. Kevin Thompson's sickly smile gradually disappeared, and his body instinctively secreted a virus flying towards the direction where Hu was. "What are you doing?" Hu frowned slightly. Didn't he just glance at the two of them? As for being so irritable. If this punch hits an ordinary head, it will end up like a stick chopping a watermelon. Looking at the painful expression on the girl's face, Hu cursed softly, sick, and turned towards the mall. He didn't have time to play cosplay with the two of them. "Stop." Kevin Thompson shouted loudly at Hu and immediately chased after him when he didn't react. "Hey! I told you to stop. You yellow-skinned monkey." Hu stopped and a hint of anger flashed in his eyes. Kevin Thompson smiled coldly when he saw that his ability was working. He held his head high and said arrogantly, "Kneel down now. Lick my leather shoes clean." Kevin Thompson felt his vision increase, and then a suffocating sensation surged in his mind. He looked at Hu's cold eyes and instinctively shouted, "Help! Help me!" Jessica, standing beside her, walked with her long legs showing unwillingness and punched and kicked in front of Hu, but all her attacks were blocked by an invisible wall 5 centimeters away. "I hate it when people call me that." Hu slowly closed his palm, and Kevin Thompson's eyes began to roll upwards. Just as he thought he was going to die like this, Hu forcefully threw him to the ground and snorted coldly, "Don't let me see you again. Otherwise, I'll see you and hit you again." Hu forcefully stepped on Kevin Thompson's head and shouted loudly, "Understood. Understood. Ming. I understand. I understand." Kevin Thompson suppressed his dizziness and shouted loudly, while Jessica watched as Hu's face showed a pleading expression, "Please, help me." "Shut up." Kevin Thompson let out a loud shout, and Hu looked at the woman with a pleading expression on her face who couldn't speak, feeling that things didn't seem as she had imagined. "Jessica Jones." Hu tentatively shouted, and the woman nodded frantically. Hu looked down at Kevin Thompson, vaguely remembering that Jessica's husband was a black man, and no matter how he looked at the guy under his feet, he didn't think he was black. The two met by chance and he didn't want to seek justice. Just then, Kevin Thompson, who was being trampled on, sternly scolded, "Since you know each other, why don't you kneel down and admit your mistake? Otherwise, I'll let her die in front of you. You damn yellow-skinned monkey. I'll peel off your skin and let you eat your own flesh." Kevin Thompson looked triumphantly at Hu and felt like he had caught his opponent's soft spot. He turned his head and shouted loudly at Jessica, "Break a finger immediately." Jessica let out a painful groan, and her left index finger showed a strange curve. Hu lifted her right foot and stomped down hard, saying in a cold voice, "Why do you have to seek death?" Kevin Thompson showed a hint of shock on his face, his body twitching slightly, and he swallowed his last breath reluctantly. Hu ignored Jessica, who was crying bitterly on the side, and a few flashes disappeared in place. He was not sure if there were surveillance cameras nearby, so he had to run first. Before he had absolute certainty, Hu did not want to reveal his identity as a mutant. He was now barely a low-end version of Superman. There were too many people in the Marvel world who were more powerful than him. At the same time, Hill at the headquarters of the Divine Shield knocked on Nick Fury's door and whispered, "Director, the woman named Jessica you asked me to monitor has been rescued." "Who saved him? Is it someone from X Academy?" Nick Fury's face turned cold. Although it didn't look much different, Hill, who had worked with him for many years, still felt Nick Fury's anger. I checked the other person's information," Hill said in a low voice with a strange expression on his face. "That person used to be a sleep therapist, but suddenly fell into the streets 10 days ago. Today, he just bought a house worth 700,000 yuan on 6th Street. Nick Fury frowned after hearing this, and instinctively, Charles's big bald head appeared in his mind. Although both of them were bald, they did not have any heart to cherish each other and often engaged in verbal confrontation. After listening to Hu's information, Nick Frey's first thought was that the mutant awakened the X gene and instantly came up with Charles's action plan. With the help of the new mutant, he rescued Jessica and expanded the strength of the X-Men. Although Jessica has some psychological issues, finding a mutant with counseling skills in the diverse X Academy is not a difficult task. Damn it! This bastard dares to play dirty with his bald head. Hill glanced at Nick Frey's head and wisely lowered his head, pretending to be a ball of air. After venting, Nick Frey's face showed a hint of helplessness. The other party wanted money, and people. If he really turned his face, his group of stinky fish and shrimp would definitely not be able to defeat the X-Men in their hands. That's it. How's Luke Cage, whom I asked you to monitor before? Hill pondered for a second and quickly recalled relevant memories in his mind. Speaking calmly, the other party opened a tavern in the downtown area and privately accepted employment to help deal with some tricky criminals. Nick Fury's face softened slightly after listening, and he said in a calm tone, "Keep monitoring, you can send someone to contact the other person." "Okay, Director." Hill nodded and turned to leave the office, starting to arrange for manpower to approach Luke Cage after strolling around the mall. Who bought a large bed and several sets of clothes. When passing by the previous hotel, he found that the police had already blocked the intersection. He frowned and walked into the nearby alley, preparing to take a detour back to his residence. "Why are you always following me?" Who turned around and glared at Jessica behind him, who had been following him ever since they met in the alley just now. "Is it about finding an opportunity to knock himself unconscious and take him to play in the secret room?" A thought flashed through Who's mind, and he turned around to carefully examine Jessica, feeling as if he wasn't at a disadvantage. Chapter 7. Tracking. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Jessica was startled by the look in her eyes, took 2 steps back and looked at Who with a wary expression, as if he were an injured beast. Who turned around and quickened his steps towards the residence, closed the door and sat on the sofa, waiting for the mall to deliver the goods to his doorstep. In the future, this will be his home. Just as Who was imagining his future life of eating melons, the door suddenly flew backwards 2 meters and slammed fiercely on the floor. "Are you sick? Why did you smash my door? Are you also a superpower?" Jessica looked at Who in a daze and said in a choked voice, "Thank you very much for rescuing me from hell." "So, is this your way of expressing gratitude?" Who pointed to the door on the ground and said in an unpleasant tone, "It's 800 at once. Give me the money immediately and disappear from front of me." "I don't have the money." Jessica lowered her head and said helplessly, "Can you take me in? I can help you work and pay the rent with the money you earned." Who touched his chin and looked at Jessica, who had a hot figure. The other person's strange ability could even pay the rent by moving bricks. Thinking of the balance in the card, Who coughed lightly and nodded. "Okay, let's rent it at a rate of 2001 months." Jessica nodded very happily. She had just observed the environment of this single-family villa outside, although the other party's fee was several hundred yuan more expensive than outside, but she's not the kind of person who cares about every detail. Anyway, she didn't plan to give this money. If she asked for money, she wouldn't want to die. If she didn't, she would just lie in bed and be bitten by a dog. "Okay, the toolbox is over there. Fix the door for me immediately." Who pointed to the toolbox in the corner of the living room, got up and walked towards the staircase to rest. He turned to Jessica, who was holding the tools, and whispered, "You can choose any room on the 2nd floor to stay." "Okay, sir." Jessica nodded seriously and picked up the toolbox to the door frame. Who looked at the hard-working figure of the other person and gave a thumbs up for her wise decision in her heart. This kind of good-looking and hard-working tool is easy for a person to use, and in the future, he doesn't need to personally carry gas cylinders or anything else. Returning to the master bedroom on the 3rd floor, Who smashed himself fiercely onto the wooden bed, and the tremendous force made the bed emit an unbearable sound. An hour later, Who woke up to a burst of noise and looked at the large truck outside the window. Suddenly, he ran downstairs in a hurry. Sigh. Where's my door? Who looked at the wall with a big hole in it, and he was feeling unwell. Jessica ran over to him excitedly and said, "Boss, they said the 3-meter-wide bed couldn't be carried in, so I dismantled the door." Looking at Jessica's expression on her face, who opened his mouth and whispered, "You're really smart. Can't you let them take down the bed and put it back for me?" Jessica wiped her saliva off her face, showing a suddenly clear expression, and whispered, "Yes, it seems like this can also be done. Get lost. Get lost upstairs, I don't want to see you now." Who waved his hand in displeasure and walked straight to the person in charge, whispering, "Are you responsible for repairing the house?" The person in charge glanced at the large hole at the front door of the house and opened his hand, feeling somewhat helpless, saying, "Mr. We are only responsible for mutual delivery and installation of furniture. You are not within our service scope." Who nodded and took out a stack of Franklin from the system backpack, placing it in the other person's hand. In a gentle tone, he said, "Please, buddy, help me for God's sake. You are truly a devout believer, let me handle this little question." Half an hour later, the truck quickly left the street, looking at the brand new door and the carefully selected large bed. Whose face showed a satisfied smile. Walking up the stairs to the second floor, Jessica walked out of the bathroom naked. Jessica glanced at the figure parked at the staircase and calmly walked back to the bedroom. It wasn't until the graceful figure disappeared into the hallway that who regained consciousness. He touched the non-existent nosebleeds and slowly returned to the third floor. This wave of welfare was truly fragrant. "Sir, do you need me to diagnose your heart rate that is too fast?" The voice of Bai came from upstairs, and who shook his head and refused the other party's proposal. He reached out and pushed the slightly bulky body of the opposite party. Jessica, who was changing clothes on the second floor, heard the commotion and went up the stairs to watch. At first glance, I saw Bai's simple and honest appearance, and instantly fell in love with this silly and cute guy. "Boss, what is this?" Jessica reached out her finger and poked Big White's belly, like a child finding a toy. "Hello, my name is Bai. Do you need me to do a check up for you?" "Of course." Jessica rubbed against Bai's soft body, and who rolled his eyes and said angrily, "I'm going to sleep while playing." Jessica's eyes lit up and she carried Bai back to her room. Who lay on the bed, looking at the newly unlocked mall and contract options on the panel. After thinking for a second, she shifted her gaze to the mall. The next second, a pile of items with prices suddenly appeared in front of her. There were 3 categories directly above the mall: real power, scroll, and life. There was a string of numbers after the 2 words, points, in the upper right corner. 2,000 points in a world. Who murmured softly, casually closing the mall and clicking on the contract option. He carefully looked at the introduction that appeared in front of him, which roughly meant that he could use the contract scroll to sign contracts with various creatures to take them out of their original world and help himself destroy it. Who opened the mall again and clicked on the scroll classification. He shook his head as he looked at the contract scroll worth 1,000 yuan. After closing the mall, he focused on the world options, and the excitement in his heart when he lit up the icon was very overwhelming. After hesitating for a few seconds, who gave up the idea of crossing over again. As long as he didn't provoke those big shots, his current strength was enough to survive and marvel. Just then, an engine sound sounded in the front yard. Who lifted the curtains and looked at the bald head sitting in the wheelchair below, as well as Chin Galay behind him. His heart suddenly quickened, and the host of the Phoenix Power was a fierce person. The laser eye walked up to the front door and tapped. Jessica, who was playing with Bai on the second floor, walked downstairs in frustration and opened the door, frowning and whispering to the uniquely shaped 4 of them, "Who are you? What are you doing here for? Don't be afraid, children. We are teachers at Xavier Genius Academy and we would like to hire you as a teacher." Jessica rolled her eyes and was speechless. Don't even the scammers investigate the information now. Isn't it funny to have a bad high school dropout teach someone? Do we have to teach the other person how to skip class ourselves? Just as Jessica was about to close the door, a voice rang out in her mind, don't be afraid of the children, we are all the same kind of people. Jessica looked at Charles with some surprise. If she hadn't met Who, she might have chosen to join the group for warmth. I prefer my current life to being a teacher. Upon hearing Jessica's answer, Professor Charles nodded slightly and shifted his gaze behind the other person. Chapter 8. Luke Cage. You are listening at novelfull.audio. I don't like being a teacher, and in the future, please don't disturb my life. This is good for both of us, isn't it? Who patted Jessica's shoulder to signal her to step back and calmly look at the four people in front of her, their eyes flashing with red light. Charles was momentarily taken aback. It was the first time he had seen someone who could perfectly control mutations. The other person's abilities were somewhat similar to those of a laser eye. After a moment of silence, Charles slowly said, please don't indiscriminately kill innocent people, otherwise. Without waiting for the other person to finish speaking, Who slammed the door tightly. Charles's mouth twitched and he felt a bit awkward. Jean Grey saw this and pushed the other person towards the lawn behind him, sitting on the invisible black bird and quickly leaving. Who breathed a sigh of relief as he listened to the gradually fading engine sound. He returned to the living room and sat on the sofa, looking at Jessica, who was somewhat reserved beside him, and whispered, don't worry, you may not encounter them in the future. Go play with Dubai. Yes, boss. After dinner, Who lay in bed, looking at the ceiling and pondering his future life. Eating melons also requires money. The best way he could think of was to wait for the Stark Industrial stock to decline and buy it crazily, then enjoy a lifetime of dividends. However, this requires a lot of money. Besides, it's about stealing 10 or 8 tons of gold from a prince who owns a mine in Wakanda and instantly becoming a world-class billionaire. But even if Wakanda had an energy shield, he couldn't find the other person's position. In the quiet night, a few faint gunshots could be heard. Who got out of bed and walked to the window, looking at the deep night sky with thoughts of robbing the rich to help the poor in his heart. That group of underground black forces probably don't mind using some money to accumulate some Inda for themselves. 5 minutes later, a figure sneakily left 6th Avenue and ran towards the Hell Kitchen in the downtown area. Jessica stood by the window, looking at the distant figure with a frown on her face. The other person's hidden and revealing attire was definitely not a sign of justice. Who sat on the rooftop, watching the 2 waves of people beating and killing below, immersed in eating melons and unable to extricate himself, completely forgetting his purpose for coming out this time. A strong black man rushed out of a bar on the street and hit the 2 waves of people who were originally displeased with each other, instantly turning their guns around, After a burst of intense gunfire, the black burly man tore off his tattered clothes and roared again towards the crowd. 3 minutes later, only the black burly man remained standing on the entire street. Go back and tell your boss that this shop belongs to my Luke Cage territory. If you want it to catch fire, go somewhere else. Luke stomped on a hole in the cement floor and stared at the 2 little bosses with sharp eyes, saying coldly, do you understand? Ming. I understand. The 2 of them spoke in unison, and Luke snorted coldly as he returned to the bar. As the door closed, the people lying on the ground immediately breathed a sigh of relief, helping each other stand up and losing the lively atmosphere they had before. Who followed a group of people from afar to a bar and casually pushed the door in. His powerful spiritual power instantly controlled everyone present, and he strolled over to a strong man to pour himself a glass of wine. He relaxed his tone and said, Hey buddy, who is your boss? I want to talk to him about a business. I am the boss here. The strong black man moved his body and looked at the motionless subordinates around him. He had a clear understanding of Who's strength and spoke softly, Are you asking me to hire you? I can't offer you a satisfactory salary here. Watching the burly man Who's comical movements, he raised his eyebrows and said in a deep voice, let me give you a number. 5 million. If I can't take it out, I'll take you away. Wait. The black man raised his hands and said helplessly, brother, do you have any misunderstandings about our industry? Do you think a small gang like me can come up with 5 million in cash? Whose eyes narrowed as the other person's heartbeat remained unchanged from start to finish. The probability of lying is very low. Looking at Whose cold gaze, the strong man swallowed his saliva and whispered, if you need it, I can give you the goods in my hand. I don't want your goods. Take out all the cash now. Okay. No problem. You're the final say. The strong man came to the wine cabinet and twisted a bottle of red wine. The entire wine cabinet immediately moved to both sides, revealing the central safe. After entering the password, the black strong man looked at Who with a flattering expression on his face. Hey buddy, all the money is here. Don't hurt me. Who wrapped the money in the safe with his mental power and put it in his backpack, watching the obedient strong man walking towards the door in disappointment. Hey, you should take those illegally obtained finances to the traffic police station. Who turned around and looked in the direction of the sound. A man wearing a red tight suit and holding a guide stick walked out of the alley. Who jokingly said, Matt Murdock, how do you plan to stop me? At the moment he heard his name, Matt's heart suddenly accelerated and he instinctively rushed out to subdue the opponent. Who stood in place, ignoring Matt's movements, and his guide stick fiercely hit his right arm, making a sound of metal and iron strikes. Matt quickly retreated and carefully listened to the opponent's movements. The previous contact made him determine that the opponent had weapons such as crutches and was extremely powerful. Matt switched between several attack methods in an attempt to identify Whose weaknesses. Are you a mutant? 1 minute later, Matt looked in the direction where Who was, and his tone was full of affirmation. Who shrugged and threw the other person into the alley with spiritual strength, and his voice said coldly, don't bother me in the future. Matt rolled around in the alley and slammed into the trash can, which was his weakest battle since his debut. The opponent treated him completely like a child. After circling around a few times, Who returned to 6th Avenue and looked at Jessica sitting in the living room. He said angrily, why do you care if you don't sleep at night? Boss, have you gone out to do something bad? Jessica furrowed her brows as if she were a brave detective facing the darkness. Who walked to the kitchen and poured himself a glass of water, throwing the money he had stolen tonight on the ground. She said in a bad tone, I'm in a dilemma, don't I have to eat? These are money from a small gang. If you feel uncomfortable, you can give them back. Hee hee. Boss, you misunderstood me. Jessica crouched down and stuffed several stacks of money into her clothes. She said with a righteous tone, next time, please make sure to bring me with you. How can you personally handle the dirty and tiring work of moving money? Who rolled his eyes and retrieved the money from the system backpack. Looking at the suddenly disappearing banknote, Jessica's eyes flashed with regret. She grabbed her pocket tightly and decided not to admit it for a while. Alright, go back to sleep. Tomorrow, go out and find a job for me. If you can't pay the rent next month, get out of here. Who glared fiercely. Jessica turned around and walked towards the staircase. After the footsteps disappeared, Jessica took out the money she had just embezzled, her eyes curved like crescents. Chapter 9. Small Gains. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The next morning, as soon as Who walked into the living room, he saw Jessica stuffing the last piece of toast into her mouth. She glanced at the empty plates above the dining table and scratched her head in embarrassment, whispering in a low voice, sorry boss, I'm too hungry to resist eating your portion as well. Looking at the other person's cutthroat demeanor, Who was too lazy to say anything. As he walked through the living room and pushed open the door, he whispered, remember to find a job. Jessica looked at the tightly closed door with some disappointment, secretly cursing Hu for not understanding the charm and lacking gentlemanly demeanor. Just as she was about to get up and go back to the room to sleep, a loud noise came from her stomach. Jessica slowly came to the door with a soft moan and bent down to pick up the 4 Franklin pieces on the ground. With a bright smile on her face, she picked up the key and rushed to the hamburger shop 2 blocks away. Hu was still thinking in her heart whether Jessica, that foolish girl, had seen the money she had thrown on the ground at this moment. A loud noise came from behind, and when I looked back, I saw Jessica disappear from sight like a second Ha who had escaped from the rope. Feeling sorry for my own iron door for 3 seconds, I decided to switch to a door made of Jinji material when I have money in the future. Jessica quickly ran to the hamburger restaurant and ordered 3 meals for 2. The waiter gave her a strange glance. No matter how much she looked at her figure, she couldn't hold so much food. 10 minutes later, the waiter looked at Jessica, who was taking burgers one by one, and suddenly felt that she wasn't as good looking as before. Jessica took a sip of cola and swallowed the food in her mouth, leaning against the seat and making a long belch. The surrounding diners looked at Jessica, who was sitting in a manly posture, shook her head, pulled up her own child, and prepared to leave. After eating and drinking, Jessica handed the waiter a Franklin, collected her change, and turned to walk outside the door. A sudden brake sound sounded on the street, accompanied by the screams of a little girl. Jessica followed the sound and saw a Ford swaying left and right on the road. The little girl standing in the middle of the road screamed and moved her body back and forth. Seeing that she was about to be hit, she quickly hugged her head and squatted down, crying helplessly. After making a loud noise, Jessica gently picked up the little girl and handed it to the rushing woman. Looking at the hurried departure of the mother and daughter, Jessica's face showed a satisfied smile. She really liked the feeling of helping others. Hey! Do you just want to leave like this? The driver pushed the door open and got off the car, looking angry. Don't you have to lose money if you beat my baby like this? Jessica, who was about to leave, stiffened and understood why the mother and daughter were running so quickly. Thinking of the driver's efforts to avoid a car accident just now, Jessica sighed and spread out her hand fearlessly, saying, "I don't have money." The strong man's eyes almost fell out, and it was the first time he had seen someone say this so confidently. The other person's appearance made him feel like he was the villain, and the words of compensation stuck in his throat, which was very uncomfortable. Just as he was about to admit his misfortune, Jessica continued, "Although I don't have money, my boss does." The man looked up and down at Jessica, defining her as a character within the circle of wealthy business lovers. Although she had great strength, her mind was not very intelligent. No wonder it's just a lover. The man put aside his thoughts and said in a deep voice, "Get in the car and show me the way. I'm going to seek an explanation." Jessica obediently got into the car and gave directions to the other party. Who walked briskly towards home. Having a backpack meant that he didn't need to bring anything when going out. "Are you here?" Who pushed open the door and looked at the 2 people sitting on the sofa, feeling as if there was something extra on their heads. What does this mean that they don't even carry their backs when raising people, and still bring them home with integrity? "Are you her boss?" The strong man stood up and glanced at Who. His face immediately changed to an angry state, pointing to the car outside the window. "Just now, while I was driving, humming a song, she suddenly grabbed the front of the car. Look at what she has done to my car." Who turned his head to look at Ford, who was severely deformed outside the window, and said in a relaxed tone, "No need to talk nonsense, let's count it. 100,000. The man's eyes showed a shred of brilliance, and he thought to himself that he had found the treasure this time. The other person looked like a fat sheep with a secure appearance. "Take it." Who took out $1,000 from his pocket and handed it to the man. Seeing that the man was somewhat surprised, he sneered, "Do you think I look like a fool like this? Either take the money and leave, or I will rob and kill you on the spot." The man snatched Franklin and ran towards the door, and the car quickly disappeared into the street with a sound of the engine. "Boss, don't be angry, listen to me explain." Jessica lowered her head and told the story, listening to Jessica's description. Who said angrily, "No matter what you do in the future, you must run away as soon as possible." "Got it, boss." Jessica nodded hard, and who opened the TV in the living room. A familiar face appeared on the screen, and his eyes flickered slightly as he watched the news that Stark was going to a military base to test weapons. He whispered, "Iron Man 1. Looking at Stark's confident smile on the TV, whose face showed a bright smile. "As the military liaison of Stark Industries, I am honored to work with such a patriot. Ladies and gentlemen, I am honored to present this year's highest honor to Mr. Tony Stark." Colonel Roddy had a smile on his face, and he felt proud of his friend's achievement. Listening to the applause from the audience, Roddy began to organize his speech for a while. His friend often played cards without following the routine and would definitely ask some tricky questions. Roddy's face showed a hint of intelligence in his grasp. Until the applause from the audience disappeared, Stark's figure was not seen. Roddy's smile gradually stiffened, and he wished to use his toes to snap out a Tony Stark. Obadiah Aston walked up to the stage with a smile and took the trophy held by Roddy, saying in a relaxed tone, "This trophy is really beautiful. Although I am not Tony Stark, I will tell everyone my honor and joy. Everyone knows that Tony's greatest strength is his weakness, and he will forget to eat and sleep when he starts working." Obadiah Aston's light-hearted and humorous tone quickly brought the scene under control. Colonel Roddy stood on the side and cursed Stark in his heart. Although no one in the audience would believe Obadiah Aston's words of forgetting to sleep and eat, they still applauded. After the scene, Colonel Roddy once again thanked Obadiah Aston for rescuing the scene and watched as the other party left. Roddy found Tony Stark's whereabouts through military intelligence channels. Half an hour later, Roddy parked his car at the entrance of the exchange meeting and walked in to look at Stark, who was chatting and laughing with a beautiful woman not far away. Although he had anticipated it earlier, he still felt his blood pressure rising. Chapter 10. Patriots. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Tony. Do you know how embarrassed I was just now? Roddy walked up to Stark and kept drooling, wishing to shoot this jerk with a gun in his heart. All right, isn't there Obadiah Aston left? Tony Stark took the trophy handed over by Roddy and casually said, "Besides, no one forced you to award the award." Roddy's face turned black with an impulse to curse. Roddy's arrival made Stark give up the idea of playing poker with two beautiful women, and they argued and left the card table. "I'll leave first. Don't be late tomorrow." "Okay, don't worry." Tony nodded insincerely and handed the trophy to a passerby. In his eyes, it was just a uniquely shaped glass with no value. As soon as she walked out of the door, a female journalist shouted loudly from a distance, "Mr. Stark, excuse me, may I ask you a few questions?" "Are you pretty?" Tony asked his confidant, Happy, in a low voice. Upon hearing him say he was pretty, Tony smiled and turned to look at the female journalist. While perfunctory about the other party's interview, Tony pondered how to invite them to play poker. The reporter brought the topic to his father Howard Stark and said that he was a businessman who was struggling to make a fortune. Tony took off his glasses and said with a serious expression, "My father helped the world defeat the Nazis and participated in the Manhattan Project. Many people, including your university professor, called him a hero." Although he harbored resentment towards his father in his heart, Tony never allowed anyone to speak ill of him in front of him. The next morning, the reporter slowly woke up from the bed and touched the cold bed, feeling a bit disappointed. In the end, the other party still chose to walk the kidney instead of the heart. Bosai walked into the room holding a set of clothes, and after a confrontation, the reporter walked out of the villa with a pale face. Bosai never cared about such a woman with little ability, knowing that she could not enter Stark's world. "Tony. You made me wait here like a fool for 3 hours." Roddy complained unhappily as he stood on the gangway. Tony waved his hand and stood in front of Roddy, whispering, all right, now it's me waiting for you. Roddy walked into the cabin with a dark face. 10 hours later, the plane slowly landed at Baglin Air Force Base. The officer who came to pick up the plane frowned slightly as he looked at Colonel Roddy, who was drunk. However, remembering the relationship between him and Stark could only be seen as not seeing it. This is Stark Industries' new product, the Jericho missile. Stark waved to the nearby missile launcher, and a missile instantly ignited and launched, splitting dozens of small missiles above the target for large-scale firepower coverage. A huge wave of air pushed Stark forward and blew off the hats of the officers. Looking at the flattened small mountain peak, the officers showed a look of ecstasy on their faces. No man could refuse this powerful weapon. Just as Tony Stark was about to leave, a phone call came in and Obadiah Aston lay on his side of the bed, whispering softly, "Tony, how's the situation going?" "Great, it's very lively here now. By the way, Obadiah, why don't you wear the pajamas I bought for you?" "That's good. That way I can rest assured. Good night, Tony." Looking at the pitch-black screen, Tony rolled his eyes. He still respects this elder, but his speaking style often makes people feel uncomfortable. Tony has become accustomed to the presence of Obadiah Aston, who always manages to handle those annoying media. With Bosai taking care of his daily life, he can do whatever he wants to do. After hanging up the phone, Obadiah Aston's face instantly darkened. He hated Tony while also jealous of his talent. Hey! He's already set off. Remember to do things beautifully. Obadiah Aston casually deleted the call record, looked at the contact person on his phone, and his mind flashed with Tony's childhood appearance. After thinking for a second, he threw the phone aside and whispered, "Sorry. Tony, I just want to get what I deserve back." Tony, who was sitting on the pickup truck, accepted the request of the soldiers in the same car to take a photo with them. Suddenly, with a loud bang, the pickup truck in front was lifted off and the convoy was forced to stop. The soldiers quickly rushed out of the pickup truck. "Mr. Stark, please stay inside and don't come out." The soldier sitting next to Tony finished speaking, opened the car door, and jumped down. After a gunshot, the other person's body slowly collapsed. Stark's pupils shrank slightly, instinctively covering his mouth to prevent him from spitting out. This was the first time he saw someone die in front of him. The intense fear made him instinctively want to escape from here, and he pushed open the car door and stumbled off towards the distance. Suddenly, a missile landed 2 meters beside him. Looking at the familiar Stark Industrial icon above, Tony's eyes flashed with a hint of surprise as he forcefully threw himself into the nearby pit. After a loud bang, Tony lay in the pit with a buzzing sound in his ears. The next second, blood began to seep out of his chest. The piercing pain made him lose consciousness, and as he watched Stark, who was seriously injured and unconscious, the leader of the 10 Precepts gang shot the little brother who had just fired a shell in the head. After discovering that Stark was still breathing, the little boss immediately sent him back to the base. The doctor simply treated Stark's wound, but the iron plates in his blood vessels were not something he could handle at his level. "I can handle the shrapnel matter." Dr. Ethan stood up slowly on the side, and with a wave of his hand, the small leader and several armed terrorists brought Dr. Ethan to Stark's side. After some operation, Dr. Ethan made a charging magnet to absorb the shrapnel, temporarily saving Stark's life. The little leader nodded in satisfaction. As long as Tony could make the missile alive, he could hand it over to Lord Man. 2 days later, Tony opened his hazy eyes and looked at the dimly lit cave. Just as he was about to get up, a pain came from his chest. "If I were you, I wouldn't be engaging in strenuous activities now." Who's there?" Tony squinted his eyes as he watched the figure emerge from the shadow, and Ethan said in a relaxed tone, "The shrapnel has entered your veins, and I can only use an electromagnet to hold them." "That's a great idea." Tony fiddled a few times and understood the principle behind his chest. After some conversation, he realized that the other person was indeed a knowledgeable person. After the threat to life disappeared, Tony remembered the emblem on the missile. At this moment, he wanted to laugh. Weapon researchers almost died on their own developed weapons, and he felt that there was nothing funnier in the world than this. Whenever he thought of terrorists using their missiles to do bad things, he felt it was difficult to breathe. He always believed that what he was doing was right, and that only by using weapons to deter others would the world be peaceful. However, reality taught him a lesson. At this moment, his beliefs collapsed and he felt like he had lost his purpose in life. Beside him, Ethan began to persuade Stark.